So no hearing for Attorney General William Barr today. He chose to sit this one out, but really we had two hearings for Barr yesterday. One by the Democrats with questions about the Mueller report and obstruction of justice, and another by Republicans on the committee who were much more interested in the Clinton emails and taking aim at some of the FBI agents who were involved in the Russia investigation. We have James Clapper, who is the Director of National Intelligence in the Obama administration, with us. And it was Republican Senator John Cornyn who asked, why didn't the Obama administration do more about Russian interference starting back in 2014, where they were warned by the intel community that this was going to be an issue, that Russia was going to try to influence the election? What do you say to that question?
Well, first of all, there's a long history of Soviet and then Russian interference in our election process going back at least to the 1960s. So unfortunately, there's a certain ambient level of Russian activity that we kind of anticipated. For me, just speaking for me, through 15 and 16, we began to see, and by the way, all truth isn't revealed in one day. As this unfolded, we gained more and more insight into what the Russians were doing and the magnitude of it, and certainly by the summer of 16, it was very, very disturbing, certainly to me personally. I've seen a lot of bad stuff in 50 years in intelligence, but nothing that bothered me viscerally as much as this. So, yeah, speaking personally, I was an advocate for doing more earlier and more aggressive, but to say that the Obama administration did nothing is not true. For one, the president, unlike our current president, directly confronted very pointedly Putin and told him to cut it out. Didn't ask him, are you doing this? Because he accepted the intelligence that he was getting. We made an announcement about it, put out a public release. I say we, Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson and I, on the 7th of October of 2016. Unfortunately, that got emasculated by, on the very same day, the revelation of the Access Hollywood tapes and the dumping of John Podesta's emails, so our message got lost. I do think, and then, of course, the criticisms levied on the Obama administration, well, you might ask, what was the Trump campaign doing the same time, with essentially aiding and abetting the Russians and having contacts, dozens of contacts with Russians, some of whom were connected officially to Russian intelligence. And
not legally aiding and abetting.
Reporting it.
To be clear, though, not meeting the legal definition of aiding and abetting.
Well, I'm using that in a parochial or a colloquial sense, I guess. Yeah. And certainly the president candidate Trump on the 27th of July exhorting the Russians to go out, an adversary, an enemy of ours, to help him in his campaign against his opponent. And by the way, the Russians complied with that request about 5 hours later. So it's a bit much. And then the other thing, of course, is probably the stiffest action that the Obama administration took on the 29th of December with the sanctions, the expelling of 35 Russian operatives, and the closure of the two intelligence dachas. What did the oncoming administration do but undermine it by informing the Russians, disregard the sanctions?
Michael Flynn, you mean?
Exactly.
So we've talked about this a few times, but I want to see what you think now because Barr addressed it in the hearing. He had used the word spying last month, which is a pejorative. I think it's very widely accepted. You feel this way. A lot of other folks in the intel community feel this way, that it's a pejorative way to talk about surveillance. So he was talking about surveillance of the Trump campaign members and associates who had contact, which was often repeated, with Russians during the election, Kremlin-linked Russians. He was asked about that. Let's listen.
You ever referred to authorized department investigative activities officially or publicly as spying? I'm not asking for private conversation.
I'm not going to abjure the use of the word spying. I think, my first job was in CIA, and I don't think the word spying has any pejorative connotation at all. To me, the question is always whether or not it's authorized and adequately predicated spying. I think spying is a good English word that, in fact, doesn't have synonyms because it is the broadest word incorporating really all forms of covert intelligence collection. So I'm not going to back off the word spying, except I will say I'm not suggesting any pejorative, and I use it frequently, as do media.
When did you decide to use it? Was it off the cuff in the hearing that day, or did you go into that hearing intending to use the word spying?
It was actually off the cuff, to tell you the truth.
It was actually off the cuff. He said, although to be clear, he paused, thought about what you could tell he was thinking about what he was saying, and he used the word spying. And he seemed to double down on that. I just want to be clear about that. He says, I don't think it has a pejorative connotation at all. What do you say to that?
Well, having spent 50 years in intel business, I would respectfully disagree with that. I do think it's a pejorative term. It connotes illegality, rogue operations, this sort of thing. It's not a term of art that's used within the intelligence community. And I always used to cringe whenever I'd see my name in a headline someplace where, head spy testifies or something. I have an aversion to the word.
And you think he knows that?
I do. I think what made it pejorative particularly is, of course, is in the context of what the president has been saying about spying on his campaign, which in my view is not true.
Because you hear him co-opting the language of the president, which is clearly pejorative, and you can't divorce those things.
Exactly.
Okay, there were a couple questions that were raised about the Trump campaign and offers of help from the Russians. Here's part of that.
Does the fact that Mr. Mueller found the Trump campaign was receptive to some of the offers of assistance from Russia, or the fact that the Trump campaign never reported any of this to the FBI, does that trouble you?
What would they report to the FBI?
That they were receptive to offers of assistance from Russia.
What do you mean by receptive?
That exchange.
Well, I thought it was a valid question on Senator Leahy's part, and I thought this is one of example of the Attorney General parsing and words and hair splitting, quibbling over definitional issues, which I don't think you'd hope that he'd rise above that. I will just say that during my time as DNI, we began to observe all these contacts with Russians. Not that we understood necessarily the content of any of these discussions, but it certainly raised a yellow flag. My dashboard warning lights were on. Why all these contacts with Russians, which of course weren't being reported.
Should it have been reported to the? So when he says, well, what would they report to the FBI?
Well, one would think, maybe I'm reflecting my Cold War warrior experience, but one would think when the Russians, and so many times, were trying to engage people connected with the Trump camp, that there might be perhaps a logical explanation for it. But they were very numerous, and again, we didn't fully understand why, but when valid Russian intelligence targets, U.S. intelligence targets, were engaging with members of the Trump campaign. That was concerning.
All right, Director Clapper, thanks so much. We always appreciate your perspective on this.